Big Shaq never thought much about a widow selling her wedding ring until he saw the fear in her eyes. Something wasn't right. When he digs deeper, he uncovers a chilling secret. Her husband didn't just die, he was silenced. The deeper Shaq goes, the more dangerous it gets. A hidden message, a murder disguised as an accident, a man in the shadows who makes people disappear. Now, they know Shaq is looking, and they want him to stop. But they made a mistake. They think he plays by their rules. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The flea market buzzed with energy. Vendors shouting out deals, customers haggling over prices, the scent of roasted nuts and cheap perfume mixing in the warm evening air. Shaq walked through it all, barely paying attention, his phone pressed to his ear as he navigated another business deal. "Look, I don't care what the board thinks. If they can't close the deal, I'll handle it myself," he said sharply, weaving between shoppers. His mind was on numbers, contracts, leverage. The chaos of the market was just background noise. Until he saw her. A woman sitting at a small wooden table, a single item placed carefully in front of her. A wedding ring. Her fingers hovered over it, hesitant, her body language torn between holding on and letting go. The way her shoulders slumped, the way she exhaled slowly, as if this moment weighed more than anything else in the world. It made Shaq stop mid-step. Something about it felt off. Shaq lingered, watching as a sleazy-looking pawnshop owner approached her. The man was in his late 50s, wearing an oversized leather jacket and a greasy smirk, the kind of guy who thrived off other people's desperation. "This the ring?" the man asked, reaching out without permission. The woman, Grace, as Shaq would later learn, flinched but nodded. "Yes." Her voice was soft, hesitant. The man turned the ring between his fingers, squinting at the small diamond. Then, he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Not worth much. I'll give you 100. Grace's expression cracked for just a second. Her lips parted, and her grip on the edge of the table tightened. $100. Shaq didn't know her situation, but he knew that ring was worth far more. And he knew what it looked like when someone was forced into a decision they didn't want to make. She swallowed hard. "That's..." She stopped herself, her eyes darting away. The pawnshop owner smirked like he already knew he had won. "Take it or leave it, sweetheart." Shaq had seen enough. 2,000, Shaq said, stepping forward. The pawnshop owner froze mid-smirk and turned, confused. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Shaq pulled out a neatly folded stack of hundreds and set it on the table. "For the ring," he clarified, voice calm but firm. The owner scoffed. "You're joking." Shaq didn't blink. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The man's mouth opened, but whatever comeback he had died in his throat. He took a step back, instinctively recognizing that Shaq wasn't someone to argue with. Shaq turned to Grace. "You don't have to sell it to him." She stared at the money, then at Shaq, her face unreadable. "Why would you do that?" Shaq shrugged. "Because that ring's worth more than $100. Her fingers twitched on the table. For a second, he thought she might actually smile. But then, something changed. Her breath hitched, just barely. She didn't reach for the money right away. She hesitated. It was subtle, but Shaq noticed the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes flickered to the side like she was expecting someone to be watching. And that's when Shaq knew. This wasn't just about money. This was something else. After a long pause, she finally picked up the ring. Her hands shook slightly as she turned it over between her fingers. Then she placed it back in his palm. Shaq frowned. "You're not selling it?" Grace swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I can't." She pushed the stack of cash back toward him, her hands moving quickly, like she was afraid to even be seen taking it. Shaq didn't understand. She had been ready to sell it. She had needed to. And now? "What's stopping you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Grace took a slow, shaky breath. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, like she wanted to tell him the truth. But then she looked around, and Shaq saw the fear in her eyes. "I just can't," she whispered. Then, before he could say anything else, she grabbed her bag and left. Shaq stood there staring at the empty space where she had been. His gut told him this wasn't over. And for reasons he couldn't explain yet, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting this go. Shaq sat across from Grace in a quiet corner of a small cafe. The flea market's noise was long behind them, replaced by the hum of conversations, the occasional clatter of plates, and the smell of fresh coffee. Grace hadn't touched hers. Instead, she sat with her hands curled around the wedding ring, her fingers running over the gold band as if memorizing its every detail. "You should keep it," Shaq said, breaking the silence. "It's yours." Grace exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "It's not just about money." Her voice was quieter now, like she was weighing every word before speaking. Shaq leaned back, watching her closely. "Then what is it about?" She hesitated. Then finally she looked up. "My husband, Michael. He died a year ago." Shaq's expression didn't change, but he noticed the way her hands tightened around the ring, the way her voice dipped just slightly on the word, died. "I'm sorry," he said. Grace gave a weak nod, staring down at the table. "It was sudden. An accident," they said. Shaq waited. He had spent years reading people, knowing when there was more to a story. And Grace? She wasn't just grieving. "His life insurance claim was denied," she continued. "They said there were complications with the paperwork." Shaq frowned. "What kind of complications?" Grace's lips pressed together. "They never gave me a straight answer. Just kept delaying, asking for more documents. And then eventually they stopped answering altogether." Shaq's gut tightened. That wasn't normal. "So now you're drowning in debt," he said, piecing it together. She nodded, her fingers gripping the ring so tightly her knuckles turned white. Shaq exhaled, thinking. "I can help you financially," he offered. "Forget the ring. I can make some calls, get someone to look into your husband's case." "No," she cut in quickly, shaking her head. Shaq narrowed his eyes. She wasn't just rejecting help. She was afraid of something. "Why not?" he pressed. Grace hesitated again, her shoulders stiffening. Then she took a deep breath, like she was about to lie to him. "Because I don't want to hold on to the past anymore," she said. Shaq didn't believe her. Something felt wrong. A few minutes later, Grace got up to leave. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, slipping the ring into her coat pocket. "And for everything else." Shaq nodded, watching as she turned to go. But as she pushed in her chair, the ring slipped from her pocket and landed on the floor, rolling until it hit his foot. Shaq bent down, picking it up. And that's when he saw it. A small engraving on the inside of the band. The letters were small but clear. "Until the truth finds us." Shaq turned it in his fingers, reading the words twice, 3 times. He looked up at Grace, and her face had gone pale. For the first time since meeting her, she looked truly afraid. Shaq's grip on the ring tightened. What truth? And who was she so scared of? Shaq sat in his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly behind him, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk. The ring lay in front of him, its inscription pulling at something deep in his gut. "Until the truth finds us." That wasn't just a message. It was a warning. Something about Grace's story didn't add up. The way she flinched when he read the engraving, the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just grief. It was something worse. Shaq didn't believe in coincidences. Michael's death, the denied insurance claim, Grace's desperation to sell the ring, none of it felt right. So he started digging. Michael Turner, a respected journalist, known for exposing corruption, uncovering secrets that powerful people wanted buried. His last published article was about a corporate fraud scandal, but it was nothing big enough to get him killed. Shaq kept looking. And then, he found it. A draft of an unfinished article, never published, never sent to print. It wasn't about corporate fraud. It was about a man named Holloway. There was almost nothing on him. No photos, no official records. Just a name whispered through redacted documents and abandoned leads. But every source Michael had spoken to before his death had gone silent. Shaq scrolled through the old emails Michael had sent before he died. One stuck out. 2. Editor-in-Chief subject, urgent, we need to talk. I have proof. This goes deeper than we thought. We're not just talking about fraud anymore. This is about people disappearing. I can't say more over email. Meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. We have to move fast. Michael never made it to that meeting. Officially, he had died in a car accident later that night. Shaq's fingers curled into fists. That wasn't an accident. Michael had found something, and someone had made sure he never talked. Shaq called Grace. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tight. I told you to stop looking into this. Shaq ignored that. Who is Holloway? Silence. Grace. Her breath hitched. I don't know. Lying isn't helping either of us. More silence. Then finally, please just let this go. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening on the phone. I can't. Grace's voice cracked. You don't understand. They're still watching. They never stopped. Shaq's pulse slowed. They? But before he could ask, she whispered, Michael didn't just die. He was murdered. And then she hung up. That night, Shaq returned to his office late. The lights were off when they should have been on. His instincts went sharp. He stepped inside. Something was wrong. The drawers were slightly open. His papers had been moved. At first glance, nothing seemed stolen. His watch, his safe, even his laptop were untouched. But then he saw it. The files on Michael's case. Gone. Someone had been here. And they'd taken exactly what they needed. Shaq wasn't just looking into a widow's past. He was being watched. Shaq knew fear when he saw it. And every single person he spoke to about Michael Turner was terrified. Michael's former colleagues, other journalists, editors, even casual acquaintances, all refused to talk. Some ignored his calls. Others shut their doors the second he mentioned Michael's name. A few gave vague condolences and rushed off, looking over their shoulders like someone might be listening. Shaq wasn't new to power games, but this was something different. Michael hadn't just stumbled onto corruption. He had uncovered something worth killing for. And Shaq needed to find out what. After a dozen dead ends, Shaq finally found someone willing to crack. He sat across from David Langley, a former journalist who used to work alongside Michael. The man's hands trembled slightly as he sipped his coffee, his eyes darting toward the cafe windows every few seconds. I shouldn't be here, David muttered. Shaq leaned forward. Tell me about Holloway. David flinched at the name. His grip on the coffee cup tightened. There is no Holloway, he whispered. At least not officially. No records, no photos, no paper trail. Shaq studied him. But he exists? David let out a slow, shaky breath. He's a ghost, a shadow. You don't find Holloway, he finds you. Shaq's jaw clenched. Michael found him, didn't he? David nodded. He swallowed hard before speaking again. Michael wasn't just chasing a corruption case. He was chasing disappearances. People who got too close to something and were erased. Shaq's pulse slowed. And Michael became one of them. David looked him dead in the eye. If you keep digging, you will too. Shaq drove straight to Grace's apartment. She barely had the door open before he pushed inside, his voice sharp. Tell me the truth. All of it. Grace stiffened. I already told you everything I know. No, you told me what was safe to say. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Michael wasn't just killed. He was silenced. You knew it. You've known it this whole time. Her breath hitched. She turned away, gripping the back of a chair like she needed something solid to hold on to. Grace. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her entire body trembled. And then, finally, she broke. They told me they'd kill me if I ever talked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. That they'd make me disappear too. Shaq's stomach tightened. Who? She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Holloway. Shaq sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, processing everything. Michael had been murdered for what he found. Grace had been threatened into silence. And now? Shaq was walking the same path that got Michael killed. But he wasn't backing down. Because now? Holloway knew his name too. Shaq sat in his office, the city lights flickering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. The world outside kept moving, unaware of the storm building beneath its surface. His desk was littered with files, some real, some fabricated, each piece carefully placed to create a lie that would force the truth out. Michael Turner had been silenced for what he discovered, but Shaq wasn't Michael. He wasn't a journalist playing by the rules. He was a man who understood power, leverage, and the way fear controlled people. Holloway had spent years staying in the shadows, pulling strings while remaining invisible. But all ghosts had footprints. They just needed to be forced into the light. Shaq leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk as he made his move. He sent one message, just one. A carefully crafted email, routed through encrypted channels but designed to be found. Michael Turner's files have been recovered. It's over. The truth is coming out. Then he waited. It didn't take long. That night, Shaq drove home, the city's neon glow reflecting off his windshield. He had lived in this town long enough to sense when he was being followed. The black SUV trailing him wasn't subtle. It stayed back just far enough to avoid suspicion from the average driver. But Shaq wasn't average. He took an unexpected turn onto a side street. The SUV followed. He ran a red light just before it switched. The SUV sped through right after. Shaq smirked. Got you. Instead of going straight to his penthouse, he pulled into an abandoned parking lot, killing the engine. He sat in the car, waiting. His heartbeat was steady. He had expected this. A minute passed, then another. Then the SUV's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed, his movements calculated. The kind of man who wasn't easily rattled. His suit was tailored, his shoes polished, but there was something cold about him. He didn't rush, didn't act aggressive, because he didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of a threat. Shaq rolled down his window, resting his arm casually on the door. You could have just called. The man's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. You've been asking the wrong questions, Mr. Shaq. His voice was smooth, unbothered. Walk away, while you still can. Shaq tilted his head, studying him. Now, why would I do that? The man took a step closer, lowering his voice. Because if you don't, Grace will be next. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened. There it was. The mistake. These men thought they could control him like they controlled others. They thought they could use fear as a leash. But Shaq had built his empire by being the man people didn't threaten. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax, to smile. You think that's how this works? Shaq said, his tone almost amused. That I scare easy? The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. Shaq opened his car door and stepped out, now standing just a few feet from him. I get it. You're used to people folding when you whisper the right threats. He took a step closer. But you came after the wrong man. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A flicker of tension, barely noticeable. Shaq leaned in slightly. Now, he said, voice lower, sharper. You're going to go back to whoever sent you, and you're going to tell them this. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the man feel the shift in power. I don't play by your rules. A long pause. Then, the man gave a slow nod, assessing, calculating. He took a step back, buttoning his suit jacket. You've been warned, Mr. Shaq. He turned and got back into the SUV. Within seconds, the tires screeched, and he was gone. Shaq stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the night. He had their attention now, and that meant he was getting close. Shaq didn't go home. Instead, he drove straight to Grace's apartment, his mind running through every possibility. If they had threatened her once, they'd do it again. And now that they knew he was involved, she was in more danger than ever. When he knocked, she answered in seconds, her face pale, her hands gripping the doorframe. She knew. They were here, she whispered before he could even speak. Shaq's jaw clenched. What did they say? Grace swallowed hard. That you're making a mistake. That if I don't stop talking to you. She trailed off, her breath unsteady. They said they'd make sure I ended up just like Michael. A sharp silence filled the space between them. Shaq stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. He looked around. The place had been searched, drawers slightly open, books out of place. Nothing stolen, just a reminder that they could get to her anytime they wanted. Grace sat down on the couch, rubbing her arms like she was cold. They're watching everything, aren't they? Shaq didn't lie. Yes. Her eyes were glassy, but she nodded, like she had already expected the answer. What do we do? Shaq took a deep breath. They had pushed first. Now, it was his turn. We make them believe they still have control, he said. We give them exactly what they want. Grace frowned. What does that mean? Shaq sat down across from her, his voice steady. It means we set a trap. Over the next few days, Shaq carefully orchestrated his next move. He let whispers spread through his network, just enough to reach the right ears. The story? That Michael's files were more than just financial records. They were proof of something bigger, something that could destroy Holloway. He made sure it sounded believable, but not obvious. Just enough bait to make them come to him. And then, he waited. 3 nights later, they took the bait. Shaq was in his office when the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the room for a full 3 seconds before the backup generator hummed to life. But it was enough time for Shaq to hear it, the soft click of a door unlocking. He didn't move, didn't panic. He simply turned his chair toward the sound, waiting. Then, the door opened. A man stepped inside. Not the one from the parking lot. Someone else. He was dressed in black, his stance predatory, but Shaq saw it immediately. The hesitation. This wasn't a hit. This was a warning. Shaq smiled, slow and deliberate. Took you long enough. The man didn't react. Where are the files? Shaq leaned back. That depends. Who's asking? A pause. Then, a second mistake. The people who own this city. Shaq's smile didn't fade, but inside he knew. Holloway wasn't just one man. This went deeper than he thought. He exhaled slowly. Well, he said, standing up, owning the moment. You better tell them to start packing. The man's brow furrowed. Why? Shaq stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because their time just ran out. A split second later, the door behind the intruder burst open. Shaq's security team moved fast, pinning him down before he could react. The trap had snapped shut. Shaq crouched down, looking into the man's eyes. You're going to send a message for me. The man swallowed hard. What message? Shaq's smile disappeared. Tell Holloway. I'm coming for him. Shaq's phone buzzed against his desk. He glanced at the screen. Grace. Something about the way her name flashed across his phone sent a sharp feeling through his chest. He picked up immediately. Shaq. Grace's voice was barely above a whisper, shaking, panicked. They were here. Shaq shot up from his chair. Who? I don't know, she choked out. I saw shadows outside my window, and then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone knocked, but when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. I think they were inside. Shaq. His hand clenched into a fist. He had told her she wasn't safe. Stay put, he said firmly, already grabbing his keys. I'm on my way. He didn't bother with the elevator. Every second felt like it could be the difference between getting to her in time or being too late. Shaq reached Grace's apartment in record time. He scanned the building as he stepped out of his car, eyes trained for movement, any sign that someone was still watching. Nothing. But that didn't mean they were gone. He knocked once. It's me. The door unlocked almost instantly, and Grace pulled him inside, bolting the lock behind him. She looked pale, her eyes darting around the room like she still expected someone to jump out of the shadows. Shaq's gaze swept the apartment. Everything was in place, but something felt off. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. You're sure they got in? He asked. Grace nodded quickly. I went into the bedroom for a second, and when I came back, my front door was unlocked. I know I locked it, Shaq. I know I did. Shaq believed her. Did they take anything? Grace shook her head. Number. They didn't need to. This was a message. Shaq exhaled sharply, trying to keep his anger in check. Holloway wasn't playing games anymore. He was making his move. Grace swallowed hard and stepped closer. Shaq, there's something I didn't tell you. His eyes snapped to hers. What? She took a deep, shaky breath. Before Michael died, he told me he hid something. He said if anything happened to him, the truth would find its way back to me. Shaq's pulse slowed. Where did he hide it? I don't know, she admitted, frustrated. I searched everywhere. I thought maybe he meant an email, a hidden document, something digital. But there was nothing. Shaq's mind raced. Michael knew he was in danger. He wouldn't have just left things up to chance. Grace hesitated, then whispered, But I think you already found it. Shaq frowned. What do you mean? She slowly turned toward the coffee table and reached for something small, her wedding ring. Shaq's eyes locked onto it, and the weight of the moment settled deep in his chest. The engraving. Until the truth finds us. It wasn't just sentimental. It was a message. Shaq took the ring from Grace's trembling hands and examined it closely. The inscription was smooth, carefully etched, almost too precise to be done by hand. His fingers ran along the inside of the band, feeling for anything unusual. That's when he noticed the slightest ridge, almost undetectable. His breath slowed. Michael hid something inside the ring, he muttered. Grace's eyes widened. What? Shaq grabbed a small pocket knife from his jacket and, with careful precision, pried at the tiny ridge. The gold shell shifted, and then it popped open. Inside the hollowed-out band sat a micro SD card. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Grace gasped softly, her hands covering her mouth. Oh my God. Shaq didn't waste a second. He pulled out his laptop, inserted the SD card, and waited. The screen flickered. One file, an audio recording. He clicked play. A voice came through, shaky but determined. Michael Turner. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it, but Holloway, he's real, and I have proof. Shaq and Grace exchanged a glance, but neither spoke. They just listened. Michael's voice was hurried, like he was speaking fast because he knew he was running out of time. I've been investigating Holloway for months. He's not just one man. He's an operation, a system built to make people disappear. Journalists, whistleblowers, anyone who gets too close. He doesn't leave evidence behind. But I found something. A rustling sound came through like Michael was moving papers. I have the records, money transfers, blackmail exchanges, names of people who were silenced. If this gets out, Holloway falls. Shaq's pulse quickened. This was it. The missing piece. Then, Michael's voice shifted. Lower, more urgent. They know I found something. I don't know how, but they do. They've been following me. I see the same black car every day. Last night my apartment was broken into. They didn't take anything. They were sending a message. Grace's hand tightened into a fist. She had lived this same nightmare. Then, Michael's voice dropped even further. If something happens to me, Grace, know this. I love you. I didn't want to drag you into this, but they would have come for you anyway. That's why I hid this here. Because they'd never look at something so small, so personal. Silence. A few seconds later, the last thing they heard sent ice through Shaq's veins. Another voice. Not Michael's. Deeper. Colder. You should have walked away, Michael. Then, a single gunshot. The recording cut out. The room was dead silent. Grace's breathing was uneven, her hands covering her face as tears slipped through her fingers. He knew, she whispered. He knew they were coming for him. Shaq sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The last voice on that recording. Holloway. Now, there was no more speculation, no more missing pieces. Michael had been murdered, and Holloway had pulled the trigger himself. Shaq took a slow, measured breath and closed his laptop. This changes everything. Grace wiped her tears, her voice still shaking. What do we do now? Shaq's expression hardened. We take this to the right people, he said. But not just any cops, not the press. Someone Holloway can't buy. Grace nodded, but she still looked scared. What if they come after us? Shaq met her eyes, his resolve unshakable. They already have. He stood, slipping the SD card into his pocket. They made one mistake, he added. They let Michael's truth find us. And now, Holloway was going to pay. Shaq sat in his office, staring at the tiny SD card in his palm. Michael Turner had died for this. For months, Holloway had buried the truth, silencing anyone who got too close. He had operated in the shadows, pulling strings, making people disappear. But now, Shaq held the one thing that could destroy him. He wasn't going to waste it. Shaq picked up his phone and dialed. The man on the other end answered immediately. I was starting to wonder if you'd call. Check your inbox, Shaq said. I just sent you something that's going to change everything. There was a pause. Then, the sound of typing, a sharp inhale. Is this real? Shaq's voice was cold. 100%. The journalist, Donovan Hayes, one of the few reporters left who couldn't be bought, let out a slow exhale. Holy hell. You realize what this means? Shaq leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. Yeah, it means Holloway is done. Donovan didn't hesitate. I'll have this on every major news outlet in an hour. Make it 30 minutes. A low chuckle. You're lucky I like you, Shaq. The call ended. It had begun. 30 minutes later, the story exploded. News stations interrupted their regular broadcasts. Social media lit up with headlines. Leaked recording exposes political murder cover-up. The man in the shadows finally unmasked. The audio played on every major network. Michael's voice, Holloway's final threat, the gunshot. People were horrified, angry, demanding justice. And Holloway? He was running out of places to hide. Shaq watched the coverage from his penthouse, Grace sitting beside him on the couch. She hadn't spoken much, her hands gripping the fabric of her sleeves as she listened to Michael's last words, words that had been silenced for too long. Then came the next wave of news. A raid. Live footage showed a team of armed officers swarming a gated mansion, Holloway's hideout. Shaq sat forward, his fists clenching. This was it. Inside the mansion, Holloway was already on the move. He had watched the news break in real time, his face pale as his empire collapsed around him. He had paid off police, controlled politicians, erased his tracks, but he had never expected Michael's voice to return from the grave. Now, he had one option left. Run. His men scrambled around him, but fear had set in. The alliances he once commanded were breaking. We need to go, sir, one of his men urged. But before Holloway could move, bang. The front door burst open. FBI, hands where we can see them. Holloway froze. His men scattered. Some surrendered. Some tried to flee. Holloway? He ran. Shaq and Grace watched as news helicopters followed Holloway's black SUV speeding down the highway. Sirens blared behind him. The anchor's voice was tense. Authorities are in pursuit. Sources confirm this is the man known as Holloway, the mastermind behind a decade of corruption and disappearances. Grace clutched Shaq's arm, her breath unsteady. He's not getting away, is he? Shaq's jaw clenched. Not a chance. Holloway's escape was short-lived. A few miles out of the city, police set up a roadblock. He tried to swerve around it. Tires screeched, metal crunched. His car slammed into a concrete barrier. Smoke billowed. The driver's side door flung open. And for the first time in his life, Holloway looked powerless. He ran. But he didn't get far. Tackled to the ground, handcuffs clicking shut. The man who had controlled so many lives, so many fates, was now just another criminal on the evening news. Shaq exhaled, watching the screen as officers dragged Holloway into the back of a police van. It was over. He turned to Grace. She sat frozen, her eyes locked on the TV, her expression unreadable. Shaq touched her hand gently. Grace? She blinked, as if waking from a long nightmare. Then, for the first time in a year, she let out a deep, shuddering breath. And she smiled. Not a big one. Not a victorious one. But a real one. For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't a widow chained to grief anymore. She was a survivor. And Michael's truth had finally been set free. The truth can be buried, but it never stays hidden forever. Michael Turner paid the ultimate price for exposing corruption, but his story didn't die with him. It only needed someone willing to listen, willing to fight. How many voices are silenced every day? How many injustices go unseen because people are too afraid to speak? Now it's your turn. Stand up. Ask the hard questions. Refuse to look away. Because sometimes, the difference between justice and another buried secret is one person who won't back down. Share this story. Keep the truth alive.